Welcome back to Learn English with Zoe. Today, we're going to cover a very interesting story called How I Became Fluent in English, which is perfect for English learners. Now let's jump in and make learning English a fun adventure together. How I Became Fluent in English. Chapter 1: The Beginning of My Struggle. I remember the first time I tried to speak English in public. My heart was racing. I could feel everyone staring at me, waiting for me to speak. My mouth opened, but no words came out. It was like I forgot everything I had learned. My throat was dry, and I felt so small. I was embarrassed and ashamed. I had been learning English for years, but when it came to speaking, I froze. I could read and write well, but speaking was hard. Why was it so difficult? I felt like something was wrong with me. Was I just not smart enough? That day, I promised myself that I would learn how to speak English fluently. I didn't want to feel scared anymore. I wanted to be confident. Every time I had to speak English, I felt afraid. I didn't want to make mistakes. I didn't want people to laugh at me. But then I realized something. Fear was holding me back. It wasn't that I didn't know the words, it was that I was afraid to say them. I had to face my fear if I wanted to get better. I decided to speak English every day, no matter how scared I was. I would start with simple things, like ordering coffee or saying hello to strangers. At first, my voice was shaky, but I kept going. One day, I ordered a coffee in English, and the person at the counter smiled and understood me. It was a small victory, but it gave me hope. Chapter 2: The Mirror Trick. One of my biggest problems was my pronunciation. People had a hard time understanding me because my accent was strong. I felt frustrated because even when I knew the right words, people didn't understand me. A friend told me about the mirror trick. She said I should practice speaking in front of a mirror. At first, I felt silly, but I tried it. I would stand in front of the mirror and say words slowly. I watched how my mouth moved. I repeated the same words over and over. Slowly, I started to notice a difference. My words were clearer. I practiced every day, even if it was just for a few minutes. The mirror became my best friend. I didn't always have someone to practice English with, and I knew I had to practice speaking. So, I started talking to myself. I would describe what I was doing in English, like I am brushing my teeth or I am making breakfast. It felt strange at first, but it helped. Talking to myself made me more comfortable with speaking out loud. It became part of my daily routine. I was no longer afraid to hear my own voice. Chapter 3: Finding a Language Partner. As much as talking to myself helped, I knew I needed real conversations. I started looking for a language partner. I joined online groups and forums where people were looking to practice English. After a few weeks, I found someone who was learning my native language and wanted to practice English with me. We agreed to speak for 30 minutes a day, 15 minutes in English, and 15 minutes in my native language. At first, it was hard. I was nervous and made a lot of mistakes. But my language partner was patient. She encouraged me and corrected me gently. We practiced every day, and slowly, I started feeling more confident. Having someone to talk to made all the difference. One thing I realized was that I wasn't really listening when people spoke English to me. I was too busy thinking about what to say next. So, I started focusing on listening. I listened to English podcasts and watched English movies with subtitles. I paid attention to how native speakers talked, their intonation, their expressions, and their pauses. I would repeat what they said out loud, trying to imitate them. It felt like I was learning to speak English in a new way, by listening more carefully. Chapter 4: Accepting Mistakes. Making mistakes was one of the hardest parts of learning to speak English. I didn't want to sound stupid. But the truth is, mistakes are a part of learning. I had to accept that. One day, I was having a conversation in English, and I used the wrong word. The person I was talking to corrected me. Instead of feeling embarrassed, I smiled and thanked them. That's when I realized it's okay to make mistakes. Every mistake is a lesson. Chapter 5: Thinking in English. One day, I realized that whenever I spoke English, I was thinking in my native language first. I would think of a sentence, translate it in my head, and then say it in English. This took time and made my speech slow. I decided to try something new. I would think directly in English. It was hard at first, but I kept practicing. I would describe things around me in English, or try to think of what I would say in a conversation. Over time, it became easier. My speech became faster because I wasn't translating in my head anymore. Learning to speak English fluently wasn't easy, but every small success kept me motivated. Whether it was ordering food in English without fear, or having a full conversation with a native speaker, each win made me feel stronger. It's important to celebrate these moments. They remind us that we are growing, even when it feels hard. Chapter 6: Immersing Myself in English. I realized that the more English I surrounded myself with, the faster I improved. I started watching all my favorite shows in English, listening to English music, and reading books in English. I made English a part of my life. It wasn't just something I studied, it was something I lived. The more I heard English, the more familiar it became. At some point, I had to stop worrying about being perfect. I learned that confidence was just as important as the words themselves. If I spoke with confidence, people understood me better. I started practicing speaking in front of the mirror, not just for pronunciation, but to build my confidence. I stood tall, smiled, and spoke like I knew what I was doing. And slowly, I started to believe in myself. Chapter 7: Dealing with Frustration. There were days when I felt stuck. No matter how hard I tried, it felt like I wasn't improving. Those days were tough. I felt like giving up. But then I remembered why I started. I wanted to be fluent in English so I could connect with more people, travel the world, and achieve my dreams. I had to keep going, even when it was hard. I learned that patience is so important when learning a language. Fluency doesn't happen overnight. There were times when I expected to be perfect quickly, but that's not how it works. I had to remind myself that every small step counts. Each day, I practiced a little more. Even if I just learned one new word or had a short conversation in English, I knew I was moving forward. And that was enough. Chapter 8: Surrounding myself with encouragement. I was lucky to have friends and family who encouraged me. They always told me to keep going, even when I felt frustrated. But I also learned to encourage myself. I would look in the mirror and say, "You're getting better every day. Don't give up." I found inspiration in stories of people who had learned English as a second language. If they could do it, so could I. Chapter 9: Joining an English Group. One day, I joined a local English conversation group. It was a group of people just like me, trying to improve their English. We met once a week, and each time, we talked about different topics. At first, I was nervous. I didn't want to speak in front of so many people. But everyone was kind, and they made me feel comfortable. Each time we met, I spoke a little more, and my confidence grew. It felt good to be part of a community where everyone supported each other. One day, I made a funny mistake while speaking English. I meant to say, "I am very excited," but I accidentally said, "I am very tired." Everyone laughed, and I did too. That moment taught me something important. It's okay to laugh at your mistakes. Learning a new language is a journey, and it's not always going to be perfect. The key is to have fun and enjoy the process. Chapter 10: Finding my speaking style. As I practiced more, I realized that everyone speaks differently. Some people speak fast, while others speak slowly. Some use a lot of hand gestures, while others are more calm. I started to find my own style of speaking. I learned to speak at a pace that felt natural to me. I didn't try to copy other people's accents or speed. I just focused on being myself, and that made speaking easier. Mistakes are not failures, they are lessons. I had to remind myself of this often. Every time I made a mistake, I learned something new. For example, I once confused the words dessert and desert. I laughed about it later, but I never forgot the difference after that. Mistakes became opportunities for me to grow, and I stopped being afraid of them. Chapter 11: Building vocabulary through stories. I realized that one of the best ways to improve my vocabulary was through stories. I started reading short stories in English and watching movies with subtitles. Whenever I heard a new word, I wrote it down. I would then use that word in a sentence every day. This made the word stick in my memory, and soon, my vocabulary grew. The more stories I read and listened to, the more words I learned. At one point, I felt overwhelmed. Speaking English fluently seemed like such a big goal. It felt impossible. But then I realized something important: I didn't have to reach fluency overnight. I could break my goal into smaller steps. I started focusing on one thing at a time. First, I worked on improving my pronunciation. Then, I focused on learning more vocabulary. By breaking my goal into smaller tasks, I felt less pressure, and I made steady progress. Chapter 12: Using English at Work. One day, I had the opportunity to use English at work. I had to give a presentation in English, and I was so nervous. I practiced for hours, repeating my speech over and over again. When the day came, I was shaking with fear. But I took a deep breath and reminded myself that I had prepared. I knew the words, and I could do this. I gave the presentation, and to my surprise, it went well. My colleagues congratulated me, and I felt so proud of myself. That moment was a turning point for me. I realized that all my practice was paying off. Chapter 13: The Role of Music. Music became an important part of my English learning journey. I started listening to English songs every day. At first, I didn't understand all the words, but I would look up the lyrics and sing along. Singing helped me with my pronunciation and rhythm. Plus, it was a fun way to practice English. I would find myself singing songs in English throughout the day, and it made learning feel less like a chore. Chapter 14: The Power of Daily Practice. Consistency was key in my journey to fluency. I made it a point to practice English every single day, even if it was just for 10 minutes. Some days I would watch a video in English, and other days I would write in my journal in English. By practicing a little bit every day, I was able to keep improving. It became a habit, like brushing my teeth or eating breakfast. And the more I practiced, the more natural speaking English felt. There were times when I doubted myself. I would think, maybe I'll never be fluent, or I'm just not good at languages. These negative thoughts made me want to give up. But I learned to push those thoughts away. I would remind myself of how far I had come. I thought about all the times I had succeeded, even in small ways. I told myself that I was capable, and that I could do this. Chapter 15: Practicing with Technology. I started using language learning apps to help me practice. There were apps where I could speak into my phone, and it would correct my pronunciation. I also found apps that connected me with native speakers for conversations. Technology became a great tool for me. It allowed me to practice whenever I had free time, and I could get instant feedback. This made me feel more confident in my progress. Chapter 16: Speaking to Native Speakers. One of the biggest challenges was speaking to native English speakers. I was afraid they wouldn't understand me, or that I would sound silly. But I knew that if I wanted to improve, I had to face this challenge. I started by joining online language exchange groups where I could talk to native speakers. At first, it was hard. I made a lot of mistakes, but the people I spoke to were kind and understanding. They corrected me gently, and I learned a lot from those conversations. After months of hard work, I realized how much I had improved. I could have full conversations in English without feeling scared. My pronunciation was clearer, and my vocabulary had grown. I took a moment to celebrate my progress. I wasn't fluent yet, but I was much closer than when I started. I felt proud of myself for sticking with it, even when it was tough. Chapter 17: Passing on What I've Learned. As I continued to improve, I found myself helping others who were also learning English. I would share the tips and tricks that had helped me, like the mirror trick and practicing with songs. Helping others reminded me of how far I had come, and it made me even more motivated to keep going. It felt good to know that my journey could inspire others. Even though I had made great progress, I knew that learning a language is a lifelong journey. There is always more to learn, and I was excited about that. Fluency wasn't just about speaking perfectly. It was about feeling comfortable and confident in English. I had come a long way, and I knew that with continued practice, I would only get better. Looking back, I realized that the most important thing was to never give up. With patience, practice, and a positive mindset, I knew I could achieve fluency. And so can you. Fluency in English is not an easy goal, but it is possible. Through my struggles and triumphs, I learned that it's not about being perfect, it's about being brave enough to keep trying. If you face your fears, practice consistently, and enjoy the journey, you will find your English voice, just like I did.